The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the usual eerie quiet of an abandoned world, but something deeper, something wrong. The kind of silence that presses in on you, like the universe itself was holding its breath. The landing crew stood in the knee-high grass, their boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The air was breathable. The temperature was comfortable. By all accounts, it was a perfect world for occupation. And yet, something gnawed at them. A strange, uneasy feeling. A low-ranking officer glanced at his scanner, then at the towering trees surrounding them. "Sir, this place is familiar." His voice wavered. Too familiar. The commander barely acknowledged him. He was focused on the horizon, where distant mountains loomed under a blue sky. The data said this planet was an uncharted, resource-rich world, ripe for the taking. But as his eyes swept the landscape, the doubt creeping into his gut became impossible to ignore. The officer hesitated, then tapped his scanner again. His fingers trembled slightly. "Sir, I think you should see this." The commander sighed, taking the device. A planetary identification reading blinked on the screen. He frowned, shaking the scanner, as if it had made an error. Then he read it again. The color drained from his face. "Wait, what?" His voice was barely a whisper. Another officer stepped forward, concern etched across his face. "What is it, sir?" The commander swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He turned the scanner so the others could see. The identification was clear. There was no mistake. No error in the data. They hadn't landed on some undiscovered alien world. They had occupied Earth. The crew froze. The realization hit them like a thunderclap. How someone started, but their voice failed them. This wasn't possible. Earth was gone. They had abandoned it generations ago, when it was declared uninhabitable. The records were clear. The coordinates had been erased from all navigation systems. No one, not even the highest-ranking officials, knew how to get back. And yet, here they were. Panic crept into the ranks like a slow-moving plague. Eyes darted around, scanning the landscape again, but this time with new understanding. The grass, the trees, the mountains, they weren't just eerily familiar. They were home. Only home wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The officer with the scanner took an unsteady step back. "Sir, what happened here?" Before the commander could answer, a sharp rustling came from the tree line. Every weapon was drawn in an instant. The air, once still, now felt thick with unseen danger. The sound grew louder. Something was coming. And then they saw it. A creature not quite human, but close enough to send a jolt of terror through the entire team. Its eyes were sunken, its skin rough and scarred, its limbs slightly too long. It stood at the edge of the trees, staring at them with a look they couldn't quite place. Then, more emerged from the shadows. Dozens. Hundreds. The crew stood frozen, their weapons shaking in their hands. One of the creatures finally spoke. Its voice was raspy, hollow, like it hadn't been used in years. "You came back." The words sent a cold spike of dread through the team. The commander's grip tightened on his weapon. What are you?" The creature's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "We are what you left behind." A suffocating silence fell over the group. Then the creatures took a step forward. And another. The commander's voice was barely a breath. "Run." The commander didn't wait for a second warning. "Move!" Back to the ship. The team bolted, boots pounding against the grass as they turned and sprinted toward their dropship. The creatures didn't chase them, not yet. They only stood there, watching, their eerie gazes following the crew's every movement. It made no sense. This was Earth. Or at least it was supposed to be. But Earth had been abandoned, left behind as nothing more than a dead world, a casualty of a planet too broken to support life. And yet life was here. The low-ranking officer, the one who had first scanned the planet, was gasping for breath as he ran. How did we not know? How did we? No questions. The commander barked. Just run. The dropship was in sight now, its dull metal surface standing stark against the green landscape. The sight of it should have brought relief, but it didn't. The ramp was still down, the engines still running, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, charged. Then the ship's comms crackled to life, a voice barely audible through the static. "Sir, you need to see this." The pilot's voice was strained, as if he had just seen something impossible. The commander slapped his communicator. "What is it?" "Static."
Moving.
"Sir, the planet. It's changing." The words sent a cold wave of fear through him. "Changing?" They reached the ramp, stumbling aboard. The commander shoved past his crew, rushing toward the cockpit. The pilot was pale, staring at the main screen. His hands trembled over the controls. The commander followed his gaze. The planet was shifting. Not physically, but something was happening to the readings. The atmospheric composition, the gravitational force, even the magnetic field, all fluctuating wildly, as if the world itself was unstable. The pilot pointed at the radar. It wasn't like this before. The screen showed the terrain beyond the ship, scanning the landscape in real time. But something was off. The trees they had just seen minutes ago, solid, real, now flickered, as if they were nothing more than illusions. And then, in an instant, they were gone. The open grassland outside the ship shimmered, then twisted into something else. Buildings. Ruined, crumbling, covered in overgrowth. Streets broken and cracked, cars rusted and hollow. The sight sent a jolt through the commander's chest. A city. A human city. And not just any city. One of their cities. Someone behind him let out a strangled breath. That's impossible. It wasn't just the land shifting. Time itself was unraveling, revealing something that shouldn't exist. The officer with the scanner stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I think we're seeing what was always here, but something someone didn't want us to." The commander's blood ran cold. A low hum vibrated through the ship, a pulsing frequency that made his teeth ache. The controls flickered. Systems reset themselves, glitching for a moment before stabilizing. And then the comms clicked on again. Not the pilot. Not the crew. A voice. "You should not have come back." The commander's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. It sounded hollow, empty, as if the voice belonged to something that had long since stopped being alive. The pilot scrambled to regain control of the ship. "We need to get out of here, now." The commander was about to order a full retreat when something outside the viewport caught his eye. The creatures. They hadn't moved. They still stood at the edge of the ruins, watching, waiting. And then, one taller than the rest, slowly raised an arm. Not in threat. Not in attack. In warning. The commander's pulse pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. To run. But something in the way that creatures stared at them made him hesitate. Then the ground beneath them shifted. Not just the land. The air. The space around them. The ship rattled. The sensors blared. The gravity field spiked, dragging the ship downward. And outside, the sky darkened. The horizon bent. The commander gripped the console, his voice barely more than a breath. "What is this place?" Then the world around them collapsed into blackness. The ship plunged into darkness. Not the kind that came with nightfall, but something deeper, something absolute. The stars vanished. The sky, the land, even the ruins outside disappeared as if they had never existed. For a brief, terrifying moment, it felt like they had been torn from reality itself. The crew shouted over one another, scrambling for control. The pilot fought against the controls, but the instruments were useless. Every screen showed the same thing, nothing. No readings. No terrain. Just an empty void. The commander gritted his teeth. "Stabilize the ship. Find us something, anything, to lock onto." "I'm trying." The pilot snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. Navigation's dead, sensors aren't picking up anything, and he stopped. His fingers hovered over the console. Wait, something's here. The main display flickered. A shape emerged from the blackness. A structure massive, ancient, and impossibly complex. It wasn't just floating in the void. It was the void. The officer with the scanner swallowed hard. Sir, I think we're inside it. The commander turned sharply. Inside what? The officer shook his head, as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. I don't know. But this isn't just a ship or a building. It's something else. Something alive. The comms crackled again. That same hollow voice returned. You were warned. A deep vibration pulsed through the walls. Not a sound, something deeper, something that felt like it was pressing against their bones. The lights flickered. The ship shifted, but it wasn't moving. It was being moved. Then a new voice, this one human, but weak, strained, barely more than a whisper. Help us. The crew froze. The commander's mind raced. That voice, whoever they were, was inside this thing. The scanner officer adjusted his readings. His face went pale. Sir, there are life signs. The commander's stomach twisted. Humans? The officer hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Yes, but they're wrong. The ship jolted. The screens flashed red. A new warning appeared on the display. Foreign presence detected. A shadow moved outside the viewport. The pilot's breath hitched. Something's coming. A shape pressed against the glass. It wasn't one of the creatures from before. This was different, twisted. A face, human in structure, but stretched, distorted, like it had been melted and reshaped by something unnatural. Its eyes locked onto them. Then the power died completely. The emergency lights clicked on, and something began knocking against the hull. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. A slow, deliberate rhythm that sent a cold chill through the crew. It wasn't just random impacts, whatever was out there wanted to be let in. The commander grabbed the sidearm from his holster and gestured for the others to be ready. Seal the doors. No one touches that hatch unless I say so. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the walls. The sound of boots moving across the deck echoed too loudly in the silence. The only other noise was the steady thud of whatever was outside, pressing against the hull, testing for weaknesses. Then, something else joined it. A voice. Faint at first. A whisper crawling through the comms, distorted and broken. Let us in. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The pilot's hand hovered over the controls. Sir, I can't tell if it's the same voice from before or something else. The knocking shifted. It wasn't random anymore. It was spreading. A dozen points of impact, moving along the hull like fingers searching for an opening. Then, without warning, the viewport fogged over. Not with condensation, but with something alive. A shape pressed against the glass. A face. Human in shape, but wrong in every way. The skin was stretched too thin. The mouth too wide. And the eyes. The eyes were empty. It smiled. The lights flickered again. The ship groaned. The scanner officer's voice was barely above a whisper. Sir, they're inside. The commander's grip tightened on his weapon. Where? A slow, creaking sound filled the cabin. Metal twisting. A soft, wet noise like something pulling itself free from the walls. Then the floor hatch shifted. Something was trying to come up from beneath them. The pilot stumbled backward. That was locked. A deep scraping sound echoed through the ship, like something sharp dragging against the metal. Then, the hatch buckled. The first impact dented it inward. The second hit harder. The third sent it flying open. A hand, thin, elongated, wrong, gripped the edge. And something began to pull itself through. The thing pulled itself through the hatch with a slow, deliberate movement. Its fingers long, skeletal, too many joints clawed against the metal as it emerged. Its body twisted unnaturally, bending in ways no human ever could. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen, something wrong. The pilot stumbled back, his breath shallow. That's not possible. The commander raised his weapon, steadying his aim. Stay back. The creature's head snapped toward him. That eerie, stretched grin widened. Then, in a voice that wasn't its own, it spoke. You don't belong here. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It wasn't the distorted whisper from before, it was the voice of their missing crewmate. The one who had vanished on the first scouting mission. The scanner officer's hands trembled over his equipment. Sir, that thing. It has his DNA. The commander didn't lower his weapon. How? The thing twitched, head jerking unnaturally. The skin shifted, rippling like something was underneath. For a fraction of a second, the face changed, morphing, struggling before settling back into that horrifying, empty-eyed grin. The ship jolted violently. Something else had latched onto the hull. More impacts. More knocking. The comms crackled. Another voice. Weak. Desperate. Human. Do not let them take you. It was a warning. But from who? The power flickered again. Systems rebooted. The main screen, once filled with static, lit up with something new. A reading. A signal. The scanner officer gasped. Sir, we're not the only ship here. The commander turned sharply. What? The officer adjusted the readings. There's another vessel nearby. It's old. Almost identical to ours, but the life signs. The commander's stomach dropped. Are they human? The officer hesitated. Not exactly. The ship lurched again. The hull groaned under the weight of whatever was outside. The knocking had stopped. Now it was scraping. Long, jagged drags of something sharp against the metal. Slow. Deliberate. Then, from the main screen, the signal changed. A final message. Broadcasted from the other ship. One word. UN? And then, the emergency alarms blared. The outer hatch breached. The breach was instant. The pressure alarm screamed as the ship groaned, metal twisting inward. The crew barely had time to react before something rushed through the opening, a blur of movement, too fast to track. The lights flickered wildly as the air filled with a deep, unnatural hum. The commander spun toward the hatch, raising his weapon. Seal it. Now. The pilot slammed the emergency controls, but it was already too late. Shadows spilled into the cabin, shifting unnaturally, crawling along the walls like living things. The creature that had emerged from below was no longer alone. A dozen figures moved in the dim light, their bodies flickering between forms half human, half something else. Their faces distorted, shifting between expressions of fear, rage, and that horrible, empty-eyed grin. The scanner officer's voice cracked. Sir, they were us. The commander's blood ran cold. The figures lunged. The first attacker was on them in an instant, its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. The pilot fired, but the shot barely slowed it down. The creature absorbed the impact, flesh rippling, reforming. It learned. The commander didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest explosive charge from his belt and slammed it against the floor hatch. Everyone move! The crew bolted. The thing reached for them, but the explosion tore through the deck, sending it staggering back. Smoke and fire filled the cabin, momentarily blocking the creatures from sight. The pilot gasped for breath. We have to get out of here. The scanner officer was already at the console. Sir, the other ship, its logs. He stopped, his face pale. It's our ship. The commander froze. What? The officer turned the screen. It showed an old transmission. A recording. Themselves. Same crew. Same mission. Same fate. The message repeated in distorted static. Do not let them take you. The realization hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't the first time. They had been here before. and they had never escaped. The ship trembled violently. The creatures pushed through the fire, their forms melting and reforming, no longer bound to human shape. The shadows twisted, consuming everything in their path. The comms crackled one last time. A voice. Not from the other ship. Not from the creatures. From the future. You have one chance. Break the loop, or you'll become them. The commander locked eyes with his crew. There was only one way out, and it meant destroying everything. The alarm screamed. The creatures closed in, and the final choice had to be made. The commander's grip tightened around the detonator. There was no time left. The creatures were closing in, their forms flickering between the crew's past selves and the monstrous things they had become. The air was thick with the static hum of the looping transmission, distorting reality around them. The pilot's voice was tight. If we do this, there's no coming back. There was never a way back, the commander said. Only a way forward. The creatures lunged as he pressed the trigger. The explosion ripped through the ship, a blinding burst of energy swallowing the twisted corridor. The force sent the crew hurtling backward, and for a moment, everything was lost in silence. Then, the loop shattered. The ship trembled violently, the twisted echoes of their past selves fading into nothingness. The repeating message on the console flickered and died. The unnatural hum ceased. The weight pressing down on reality lifted. The commander gasped for breath, pushing himself up from the wreckage. Around him, the crew stirred, shaken but alive. The air smelled of scorched metal, but the suffocating presence of the creatures was gone. The scanner officer pulled himself to the console, hands trembling. The logs, they're gone. The loop is broken. The pilot exhaled a shaky breath. Then it worked. The commander stared at the wreckage, his mind still racing. They had escaped the cycle, but the price was high. The comms crackled one last time. A final message. No static. No distortion. Just their own voices, recorded from moments ago. You have one chance. Break the loop, or you'll become them. A warning. A message to themselves. A reminder that, somewhere in another fractured timeline, another version of them had failed. The commander stood, gripping the railing as the ship steadied itself. The nightmare was over, but something told him they weren't the first ones to come here and they wouldn't be the last. The pilot set course for home, engines humming back to life. The stars stretched ahead, empty and endless. For now, they had survived. But deep in the wreckage, buried beneath the twisted remains of the other ship, a single console light flickered back on. A recording began to play. Do not let them take you.